Hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us today. Welcome to this month's Connect and Explore webinar. It's brought to you by the National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity Research, also known as INCORE. And our spotlight topic today is measuring diet quality across the lifespan, introducing the new Healthy Eating Index for Toddlers 2020 and the Healthy Eating Index 2020. After our panel today, we are going to have some time for questions from the audience as well, and we'll close out the very end of today's webinar with a few INCORE announcements. Right now, I'd like to do some introductions. First, my name is Karen Hilliard from the INCORE Coordinating Center, and I will be the facilitator for today. I'd also like to introduce you to our fantastic panel of speakers for today. Joining us today from the Risk Factor Assessment Branch, the RFAB, of the Epidemiology and Genomics Research Program at the National Cancer Institute's Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences. That's a long one, but joining us today from there is the Chief of the Risk Factor Assessment Branch, Dr. Jill Reedy. She oversees research and initiatives that focus on diet, physical activity, and sleep methods, as well as digital health technologies and integration of modifiable risk factors, including obesity policy research. She serves on multiple NIH collaborations and working groups with other federal partners to develop resources for researchers, such as the one that we're going to be looking at in today's spotlight, the Healthy Eating Index. Also joining us from the Risk Factor Assessment Branch at NCI is Dr. Marissa Shams-White, and she is the program director there. And in this role, she supports work in dietary patterns, measures for diet and sleep assessment, including screeners, the emerging areas of systems science, and the measurement of 24-hour behavior patterns, including diet, sleep, and physical activity, as well as measurement error and obesity policy research. Also joining us today is Tusa Rebecca Panucci, and Dr. Panucci joined the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion as the lead nutritionist for the Nutrition and Economic Analysis team in 2015. In this role, she leads a multidisciplinary team conducting analyses for a variety of projects related to food guidance, and she provides leadership for organizational and technical aspects of data analysis related to the dietary guidelines for Americans. Also joining us today is Jennifer Lerman, who is a doctoral candidate in the Human Nutrition Program at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's also a program analyst in the Risk Factor Assessment Branch of the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences at the National Cancer Institute, where she collaborates with a team of scientists to develop, evaluate, and utilize the 2015 and the 2020 Healthy Eating Index, as well as the new Healthy Eating Index for toddlers created in 2020. Dr. Kirsten Herrick is a program director with the Risk Factor Assessment Branch of the Epidemiology and Genomics Program, also at the NCI Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences. And her focus is on developing, designing, and conducting nutrition research related to dietary methods, dietary instruments, measurement error, dietary surveillance, and nutritional epidemiology. Dr. Herrick also oversees the web-based automated self-administered 24-hour dietary assessment tool and the Diet History Questionnaire, which is NCI's publicly available food frequency questionnaire. So we have a fantastic panel today. You're going to be hearing from all of them. Before we get underway, though, I wanted to let you know about a few things. First of all, if you need technical assistance at any point during the webinar, please let us know using the chat box. And if you're having trouble or you know someone who's having trouble logging into the webinar, please email us at incore@fhi360.org. and we will work with you to resolve that problem. And finally, if you have a question for our speakers during the webinar, we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A at the end, but As you think of those questions, please feel free to go ahead and post them, but we would ask that you please write your questions in the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen. You'll see the icon for Q&A. That is the only place that we will be answering questions, so please post them there. And finally, we are going to be tweeting today's webinar from the NCORE Twitter account, now known as X. To join the conversation, you can use the hashtag #ConnectExplore. All right, now to get a sense of who is in the audience with us today, we have a few quick poll questions for you. And they're going to appear all at once on the screen. You may have to scroll down to get to all of them, but let me go ahead and read them. And if you can answer each of these, that would be fantastic. So the first question is, which of the following best describes your familiarity with USDA's Healthy Eating Index? Never heard of it, aware of it, but don't know much about its details, have a basic understanding of its components and its purpose, or well-versed in it and in its guidelines. So tell us a little bit about your familiarity with the Healthy Eating Index. And then second question, we'd like to know how, if at all, you are using the Healthy Eating Index. And several of these might apply, so select all that apply. And again, you can scroll down to find this question. So which of the following best describes your use? I've not used it, using it for monitoring and characterizing dietary intakes, using it for examining the effect of an intervention, maybe relating the index to an outcome, using it as a covariate, maybe multiple uses, or something else. And if you're using it for something else and can let us know about that, we would love to hear more about what you're using it for. So you'll be able to contact us today, and we would love to hear more about that. Finally, third question is what age groups you use it for. And you can find those listed all the way from infants up through even older adults, 60 plus, and all the ages in between. So please check all that apply. And we've got a large group today, so it's taking just a moment to get all those answers in. So we'll pause for just a moment and give everybody an opportunity to select their answers. And once the answering slows down, we'll reveal the results for everyone. All right, I think we've got almost all of our responses here. If you haven't responded yet, let me ask you to go ahead and do that, and we'll just count down. Any last responses? 3, 2, 1. And let's go ahead and end that poll and take a look at what the results are. All right, and hopefully everybody has seen those results now. And just to take a quick look, in case you're not able to see the results of the poll here on the screen, looks like about almost half of the folks joining us today have a basic understanding of the components of the Healthy Eating Index. But we've also got a few folks who haven't heard of it before, a few folks, really over a quarter of our audience, who has either heard of it but doesn't know much about it or hadn't heard of it before today. So that's great. We're really excited you're here and able to learn more about it. And then a little over a quarter of the folks joining us who are well-versed in the Healthy Eating Index and its guidelines. So we'll try to bring everybody on board so that you all leave with a good knowledge, not only of the index, but what you can use it for. And it looks like of the folks that responded about their uses, we've got just a variety of things. About 40% of you haven't used it yet, so we hope that'll change after today's webinar. But we also got some folks that are using it for a variety of different things, examining the effect of interventions, relating it to outcomes, using it as covariates, and so on. So that's great. We're really excited that some of you are beginning to put this to use. And also, it looks like the majority of people today are using it or a majority of folks are using it for adults. Some smaller numbers using it for different age groups of children and adolescents, but we've got quite a range here, and that's fantastic to see as well. So thank you so much for responding to those questions. That gives our panelists a little bit of a better idea of who's out there and how we can make sure that you leave here with the information that you need to know about about both of the indexes that we're going to be talking about today. All right, well, with that, I would like to go ahead and turn things over to our first speaker of the day, and that is Jill Reedy from NCI. So Jill, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. We are really excited to introduce you to the new Healthy Eating Index Toddlers 2020 and the Healthy Eating Index 2020. And we're going to be using the acronym HEI for the Healthy Eating Index throughout the webinar. Next slide. I'm going to start us off with a brief background about the HEI, and then Marissa Shams-White will review the process and update of the HEI 2020. Tusa Rebecca Panucci and Jennifer Lerman will highlight the development and evaluation of the HEI Toddlers 2020. And Kirsten Herrick will discuss continuity, considerations, and future directions for the HEI. Lastly, as you heard, we'll have time for discussion and questions and answers from all of you. Next slide. Let's begin with a bit of background. Next slide. HEI is a standardized scoring metric that can be used to determine overall diet quality or total diet, as well as the quality of multiple dietary components. There are currently 13 components that are scored separately and then combined for a total score of 0 to 100 points. A high score reflects optimal alignment with the science-based recommendations and the dietary guidelines for Americans. Since 2005, the HEI has been updated and evaluated every 5 years for use with children and adults 2 years and older to align with the cadence and the updated dietary guidelines after they're released. The most recent guidelines included new comprehensive recommendations across the lifespan and necessitated the development of a new index for young children. Next slide. The HEI has a long and robust history of evolving to align with the state of the science. And this timeline just illustrates the release of the dietary guidelines every 5 years and the associated launch of the HEI. And you'll note with the red square that this is the first time we've released 2 HEIs. Next slide. The HEI has been used to characterize the state of the American diet, and this figure is from the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines, and it illustrates adherence to the dietary guidelines across different life stages using the HEI 2015. And there are 2 things I wanted to note with this slide. The first is that there's significant room for improvement in diet quality for all age groups in the United States. You can see the U shape as we look across the healthy eating trajectory, with the highest scores among 2 to 4-year-olds and also among older adults, 61 points and 63 points. And then the lowest scores for teens at 51 out of 100 points. Regardless of the age group, these are not very good grades. Next slide. The second thing I wanted to note is that the scores start here at age 2 to 4-year-olds, because until 2020, we didn't have guidance for birth to 24 months old. And until now, we did not have an HEI for these young children. Next slide. The overall process here can be conceptualized as cyclical, with nutrition research laying the foundation for the dietary guidelines, and the dietary guidelines laying that foundation for the Healthy Eating Index. Additionally, the HEI is used in various ways by researchers, which is part of the science base that may then inform the next dietary guidelines. So that goes around and around. Next slide. This figure shows the number of articles that have used the HEI over the last 15 years. And you can see that the publications have grown steadily, with over 100 studies applying the HEI 2005, 250 using the HEI 2010, and nearly 400 using the HEI 2015. Next slide. This figure summarizes the different kinds of research that can be done with the HEI. It's a simple figure, but there's a lot of complexity embedded here, as there are multiple interactions and feedback loops. The center shape illustrates that the HEI can be used to describe dietary patterns at the individual level, as well as different levels of the food stream. The HEI can also be used to explore questions of interest related to drivers of dietary patterns, and to examine the consequences of dietary patterns on health outcomes. So we look forward to learning more from all of you as the new HEIs are applied to address new questions. Next slide. The publications in Jan this month mark the official launch of the HEIs. We also have other information available on our 3 websites from NCI, USDA, and NCORE about how to use the HEI, as well as other resources, including fact sheets and SAS code. We also have an HEI listserv that you can join to get updates as the website continues to be updated through the month of September. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Shams White to introduce the HEI 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you. So I'm going to take us briefly now through the process we follow for updating the HEI after the release of each dietary guidelines. So I'll break this down step by step and focus on the HEI 2020 for this example. Next. Oh, there we go. So the first step is to gather information. So from the updates from the dietary guidelines, experts, and federal stakeholders. And a working group co-led by NCI and USDA's Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion was developed with expertise in nutrition, biostatistics, index development, and other needed content areas, like, as we'll share today, was needed in early childhood nutrition due to the expanded guidelines in the dietary guidelines for birth to 24 months. And the group reviewed the dietary guidelines after its release, and then we convened a meeting with federal stakeholders to share the HEI's key features and guiding principles, constraints and opportunities to consider. We learned more about how federal partners have used the HEI and discussed the HEI development process and future considerations. That working group then met weekly. Next. And during these weekly meetings, we considered what substantial changes were needed to best align the HEI with the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines. And we aimed to maintain continuity across the iterations of the HEI as much as possible to reflect the consistency of the recommendations over time. Because our goal is to make evolutionary changes to the HEI that best reflect the dietary guidelines rather than revolutionary changes every time. And since 2005, with the first HEI, there are several features we review and affirm and guiding principles that we keep in mind. Next. So here are the 6 features we reviewed since 2005. So first, to assess diet quality, as I mentioned, with regard to the recommendations of the dietary guidelines. To assess diet, so foods and beverages and nutrients from them and not supplement intake. We capture balance among food groups, including foods to encourage and foods to reduce. We uncouple dietary quality from quantity, employing a density-based approach, and this enables application to various levels, including groups of people, environments, and the food supply. This will employ a least restrictive approach to set standards for maximum scores, and we do this by using the recommendations that are easiest to achieve among those that vary by age and by sex. And lastly, we require no single food or commodity to be indispensable to getting a perfect score. And this last feature allows for the accommodation of a variety of eating patterns to reflect cultural, ethnic, and personal preferences and tolerances, as well as food costs and availability. So again, each time we aim to review and update the HEI, we review and affirm these 6 features. Next. We also keep in mind guiding principles. So first, we only make changes that have a strong rationale. So we focus on key recommendations in the guidelines. And again, we aim to be evolutionary, not revolutionary, because unsubstantiated changes to the HEI could otherwise imply that there's new evidence that's emerged to inform these changes when it doesn't exist. We also limit the number of components. So each component of the HEI should assess a critical aspect of diet quality. Third, we avoid an unduly complex algorithm because the index should be transparent and straightforward to explain and apply. And lastly, we added a 4th guiding principle for the HEI 2020. So we want to allow for the bridging of components. So the index should be flexible to support examining healthy eating trajectories across the lifespan. Next. And the USDA dietary patterns, including those shown here in the first bullet, serve as the foundation for the HEI and provide the standards and framework for operationalizing the HEI's alignment with the dietary guidelines. And they can be customized based on cultural foodways, on budget considerations, and on other factors. And these were almost the same in 2015 to 2020 and 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines. So keeping the features and guiding principles in mind that I briefly shared, these similar dietary patterns, and given there were no major changes in the dietary guidelines for those 2 and older. Next. There were therefore no new changes to the HEI, again, given that changes could be misinterpreted as new evidence that didn't exist between the two guidelines. So as with the HEI 2015, the HEI 2020 has the same 9 adequacy components shown on the left and the same 4 moderation components shown on the right. The naming, though, of the HEI was still updated because we wanted to highlight this alignment with the most recent dietary guidelines. Next. And this table highlights the components and scoring standards for the HEI 2020. And I don't expect you to take this all in, but wanted to show the range of minimum and maximum scores for each component and highlight a couple examples for you. Next. So for example, for total vegetables, no vegetable consumption receives a minimum score of 0, whereas 1.1 cup per 1,000 calories scores the maximum score for this component. Next. Here you can see an example of a moderation component in red. For added sugars, the minimum and maximum cut points are 26% and 6.5% of energy, respectively. So I wanted to show these two examples to highlight that for the adequacy components, higher intake receives a higher score, while from moderation components, it's the reverse. So a lower intake will receive a higher score. Great, thanks. So the final step in the development of the HEI is evaluation. So to actually, next one more time. Great, thanks. So to examine content validity, the key recommendations from the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines that correspond to the related components of the HEI 2020 were examined to ensure they're reflected well by each of the components. And we didn't further evaluate HEI 2020, given the detailed evaluation process that the HEI 2015 underwent. And again, there were no changes between the two indices. However, as you'll hear in a later presentation, other parts of this evaluation process typically include evaluating construct validity, concurrent validity, and reliability. Next. And as shown here, and this looks similar to what Dr. Reedy showed earlier, the HEI is a unidimensional total score. And this has been updated from the one shown earlier with the HEI 2020 using nationally representative data from NHANES 2011 to 2018 for those 2 and older, as you can see grouped on the bottom axes. Again, there are slightly different scores, but there's a similar trend across the lifespan as seen earlier. But I'd also like to illustrate how we can see further details when we look at the multidimensionality of the score using radar plots. Next. So I'm going to illustrate the HEI 2020 by age group, but before I do so, I want to quickly review how to read a radar plot. Next. So displayed here are the 13 components. These are the spokes of the graph, and you can see the components listed on the outer circumference. And circled here as an example are the moderation components grouped together. And the spokes, and as you'll see soon with the plotted points, are connected to highlight patterns. And the closer the point is to the outer edge of the circle, the closer the score is to 100% of the maximum score for that component. Next. So here's an example of the highest score and HEI of 100 on the outermost line. Next. Conversely, closer to the center represents lower scoring for each component. Next. So I'm going to show again an example of the HEI 2020 by age group using again nationally representative data from NHANES 2011 to 2018. Next. Again, the outermost green line here represents a perfect score of 100, and plotted here, I'm going to start here with the 2 to 4 years. And if you can advance 3 times for me. So you can see here the grouping of 5 to 8, 9 to 13, and 14 to 18. And on that unidimensional total score, we saw that there was a decrease. But here, now you can see that this allows you to see the components that are driving that decreasing score of HEI 2020 by age. So for example, looking at the changes for total on whole fruits, for dairy, added sugars, and you can see a change with sodium with a reduction in score for those components. Next. And so for adults, I'm going to group together those 19 to 59 years for the example because 19 to 30 and 31 to 59 were so similar, they completely overlapped. But this is an example compared to the next slide, please. You can see here older adults have higher scores, and you can see again here what may be driving those differences. So again, using these radar plots helps illustrate additional context for each life stage, and you can look at this across the lifespan. Next. Okay, great. So once we complete this update process, we release the new HEI. So the HEI 2020 is now published and contains, the paper contains more details of what myself and colleagues are sharing today. And we have some website updates as well, and further updates are coming soon, including to provide SAS macros to help use the HEI in your research. Next. Now, as I mentioned, I quickly took you through this update process with the HEI 2020 for those 2 and older as an example. But in addition, the scientific report of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Committee recommended developing a scoring system for infants and toddlers. And given these updated recommendations, there were changes that we needed to consider for this age group. So looking at this process, it led to additional discussions on its development and for further evaluation. So for more on this, I will pass the virtual baton first to my colleague, Dr. Panucci.
Thank you so much. A lot of what you heard Dr. Shams White talk about is a nice orientation to the process to develop the HEI Toddlers 2020. You'll notice the similarities as we go through, but I'll put some focus on what makes the HEI Toddlers 2020 unique to the intended age group. Next slide, please. So our first step was to gather information. The HEI team reviewed the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans and met with key stakeholders in the initial information gathering phase. We also explored the literature to better understand whether indices may already exist and how they might be similar or different to the HEI. Although children younger than 2 years have been the focus of much recent research, only 3 diet quality scores developed specifically for infants and toddlers in high-income countries were identified. Existing indices included the Complementary Feeding Utility Index, the Diet Quality Index score, and the Toddler Diet Quality Index. These existing indices vary in design and scoring approach. Some include behavioral information, such as breastfeeding duration, a scoring that doesn't implement a density basis like the HEI, or emphasize particular food types that aren't a part of key recommendations for the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. We concluded that there was indeed a need to develop the HEI Toddlers 2020, and we did that to measure alignment with the key recommendations of the Dietary Guidelines, and it would be robustly evaluated using best practices for index evaluation highlighted in recent literature. Next slide. The next step then is to consider substantive changes. As Marissa noted, there were no substantive changes identified that would result to changes between the HEI 2015 and the HEI 2020. However, given the guidance and dietary patterns specific to young children under 2, there is a need for a separate index for this age group. We still want continuity across these 2 tools and follow the same general process and goals for development. Next slide. The same features of the HEI that have already been shared apply to the development of the HEI Toddlers 2020. To implement these features, we need to examine the dietary patterns applicable to this life stage. Next slide. This table displays the healthy US-style dietary pattern to illustrate the specific amounts and limits for food groups and other dietary components that make up healthy dietary patterns. This pattern is provided at calorie levels ranging from 700 to 1,000 calories per day, which are appropriate for most toddlers ages 12 through 23 months. A healthy dietary pattern includes a variety of nutrient-dense foods from each of these food groups. A couple of things to point out: that this is a pattern for 12 through 23 months who are no longer receiving human milk or infant formula. And what's shown here is the example for the healthy US-style dietary pattern. But I do note that a vegetarian-style pattern was also developed and examined as a part of our process to develop the HEI for this life stage. So this pattern is not applicable to infants younger than 12 months, as the dietary guidelines did not include dietary patterns for that age group. That said, the guidelines did note that for infants receiving human milk after 12 months, that a similar combination of complementary food and beverage is recommended. Next slide. So in addition to applying the features of the HEI, we also applied the guiding principles. And in considering the development of an HEI for a previously excluded life stage, we added a new guiding principle, allowing for the bridging of components. This concept of bridging refers to the consistency in components between the HEI Toddlers 2020 and the HEI 2020 for ages 2 and older. It allows researchers to consider how these 2 tools might be used in conjunction when studying populations and varied ages. So the HEI Toddlers 2020 for those younger than 2 years, and the HEI 2020 for those 2 years and older in a given population. The rationale here is that the index should be flexible to support the examination of healthy eating trajectory across the lifespan. Next slide. So that brings us to the components and scoring standards for the HEI Toddlers 2020. It has the same components as the HEI 2020. However, the scoring standards are founded in the USDA dietary patterns specific to young children ages 12 through 23 months. So like the HEI 2020, higher intakes of adequacy components and lower intakes of moderation components result in higher component scores. So the maximum component score is informed by the least restrictive quantity, or the easiest to achieve across the calorie levels in the pattern. And then the minimum score is for zero intake of that component for the adequacy component. However, there are some components where there are unique considerations that I'll review. So for the moderation component, it's less obvious how to set a minimum score, since higher intakes should reflect lower scores, but how high should those intakes be to get a score of 0? So for these, you use the same process that was done for the HEI 2020, in which the standards were set at approximately the 15th percentile of intake for fatty acids, or between the 85th and 90th for the other moderation components. And these percentiles of intake were calculated using one-day intake distributions from the 2011 to 2018 cycles of What We Eat in America NHANES. And this approach to setting the standards helps with increasing consistency across the components and the scoring rationale, and then setting a minimum and maximum scores that are associated with intakes that are considered deleterious or excellent. And it also follows precedent where applicable, such as the HEI 2020, and covers that range of intakes. There are also some considerations for setting maximum scores that I'll review for whole grains, sodium, added sugars, and saturated fat on the following slides. Next slide. So when I presented the dietary pattern for 12 to 23 months, you may have noticed that there are no remaining calories for other uses that can be further allocated to added sugars. The guidance is to avoid foods and beverages with added sugars for those younger than 2. We considered the nutrient profile for the food groups modeled in the patterns for 12 to 23 months, and they have scant amounts of added sugar. It ends up being generally less than 1% of the total energy of the pattern. So to align with the guidance, the maximum scoring standard for the added sugars component is 0% of energy from added sugars. Next slide. The next scoring standard with unique considerations is sodium. The dietary guidelines for Americans rely on the dietary reference intakes developed by the National Academies for Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So in this case, for sodium, the guidelines carry forward the chronic disease risk reduction intake for sodium defined in the DRIs, which for the 1 to 3 year age group is 1,200 milligrams per day. Lower intakes of sodium are expected for children at the lower end of this age group because their energy intake is lower. However, the DRI is not adjusted or defined for smaller energy levels. So if we applied the DRI on a density basis for the standard for maximum score, it would be 1.2 grams per 1,000 calories. This is more lenient than the scoring standard for the HEI 2020. It's not really logical that a more lenient scoring standard would be applied to ages 12 through 23 months than for ages 2 and older. So in the absence of a rationale to apply that least restrictive or more lenient scoring standard, we implemented the same maximum scoring standard for both indices. So the standard for the maximum score of the sodium component is 1.1 grams of sodium per 1,000 calories. Next slide. Next, I'll walk through the considerations for saturated fats. The limit of less than 10% of total energy from saturated fats does not apply to children younger than 2 years, primarily due to the relatively small energy needs and higher nutrient needs, along with the allotment of saturated fats from dairy products, such as whole milk in this age group. There aren't any remaining calories in the dietary patterns that could be attributed to additional saturated fats. So therefore, saturated fat While there is no limit, it also cannot exactly be unlimited within each energy level without displacing the energy available to achieve other food group and subgroup goals. So the standard for the maximum score is based on the least restrictive amount included in food pattern modeling for this age group, which is approximately 12% of energy from saturated fat. We do want to make an important note. This standard, with its underlying range, is not at all intended to imply that saturated fats or total fats should be systematically restricted in this age group, and that's important to remember. Next slide, please. Finally, I'll review the considerations for whole grains. So the language in the recommendations for the guidelines is to include grains, at least half of which are whole grain. So the patterns for 12 to 23 months have closer to three-quarters of total grains as whole grains. Because there are multiple 1,000 calorie patterns in the dietary guidelines, there's one for 12 to 23 months, and there's one for 2 to 3 years. The 1,000 calorie pattern for children ages 2 to 3 years were also considered for all standards. Interestingly though, only with whole grains did we see that there was a difference in the scoring standard between the two 1,000 calorie patterns. So in this case, we considered the least restrictive score from the 1,000 calorie pattern for ages 2 plus instead of 12 to 23 months and setting the standard while still maintaining alignment with the key recommendation. So this ends the considerations for scoring standards that are unique to this age group, but I do want to discuss one more important consideration that is relevant to applying the standards. Next slide, please. We want to point out the flexibility for using the Toddlers-2020 among young children who might still be receiving human milk or infant formula in the second year of life. The DGA recommend that when possible, infants should be exclusively breastfed for about the first 6 months with continued breastfeeding while introducing appropriate complementary foods for 1 year or longer. In fact, there's data that indicate that even at 12 months, nearly 20% of toddlers continue receiving human milk. That said, dietary patterns were not developed specifically for children receiving human milk. The guidelines recommend that a healthy dietary pattern for those receiving human milk should include similar combination of nutrient-dense complementary foods and beverages from each of the food groups and subgroups. Therefore, the Toddlers-2020 offers flexibility in scoring the complementary foods and beverages among children who are still receiving human milk or infant formula. The total score, though, is based only on the complementary foods and beverages and the energy from them and does not include energy or nutrients from human milk or formula in the calculation of the score. Next slide. All right, so this just brings us to the next part of the development process, which is evaluation. Next slide. We use multiple strategies to robustly evaluate the HEI, and my colleague Jen Lerman will cover most of these in the next presentation. I will just cover content validity, in which we check to see if the developed index does indeed reflect the facets of the guidelines. So again, this table outlines our question: does the index represent the key recommendations and the dietary patterns of the dietary guidelines for Americans? And we're going to compare the features of the HEI Toddlers-2020 to those key recommendations and patterns. We expect that the features will guide those scoring components to represent the intended facets. In summary, the components and scoring standards affirm the goal of complementary feeding: to learn to eat different foods, flavors, and textures, establish a healthy eating pattern, and transition to a healthy family diet by age 2. And the standards and scoring approaches highlight the focused guidance for this group. Next slide. So we're confident that the HEI Toddlers-2020 achieves content validity goals, which leads to further evaluation that's needed. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jen Lerman to talk about the robust evaluation of the HEI Toddlers-2020. Jen?
Thank you, Dr. Panucci. I will be going into a lot more detail on the evaluation process for the HEI Toddlers-2020, but I want to start by emphasizing that it was important to us to follow the methodology used for prior iterations of the HEI when evaluating this first version of the HEI for toddlers. Next slide. So you've seen this slide already when the development of the HEI toddlers was just being discussed, and as was introduced earlier, we followed a process to evaluate the content validity of the new HEI toddlers, represented here in gray, And after we completed that process and developed the index standards, we utilized multiple data sources to evaluate the psychometric properties of the new index in the same manner that we've previously evaluated HEI's 2015, 2010, and 2005. This time, we set out to ask and answer 7 questions about the toddler index. 5 questions were employed to assess construct and concurrent validity, and 2 were used to examine reliability. Next slide. To orient our analyses, we used 2 main data sources. First, we used exemplary menus, which included a sample one-day menu for 1-year-old toddlers provided by the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as a sample menu for toddlers published by Healthy Eating Research, a program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. These menus are designed by experts in the field of toddler nutrition and can be thought of as exemplars of healthy or high-quality diets in this age group. Our second data source was the diet recall data from 4 cycles of NHANES from 2011 through 2018. The NHANES analytic sample included 1,717 children aged 12 through 35 months. Participants were excluded if they did not complete or did not have a reliable recall, if they did not have weight for age information, and if they reported consumption of only human milk or infant formula. If participants reported intake of human milk or infant formula in addition to complementary foods, they were retained in the analysis, but energy contributions from infant formula and breast milk were not included in the HEI toddler calculations because the index is designed to assess diet quality of complementary foods. Usual intake was estimated with the Markov chain Monte Carlo implementation of the multivariate NCI method. We modeled age as a cubic spline to account for rapidly changing dietary behaviors in this age group. Finally, statistical significance was determined using the Benjamini-Hochberg false discovery procedure, given the number of tests and comparisons we were making. Next slide. In order to present the evaluation analyses comprehensively but quickly, I'm going to present to you each question that we asked, the methodology that we used to answer it, our expectation of what the findings would be, and a brief synopsis of the results. For anyone who has looked at our publication, this format follows Figure 1 in the paper. First, I will talk to you about our menu analysis, which was one way we assessed construct validity. We wanted to know whether the index yields high scores for expertly designed menus, and conversely, whether it would yield low scores for poor diet quality intake days. To answer these questions, we scored the 2 exemplary menus from the AAP and Healthy Eating Research, and also investigated the reported foods in a random sample of NHANES diet recalls scoring less than 40 total points. Next slide. So here you see the results of the menu analysis. And in the first column, each component of the HEI toddler score, and next to that, you see the maximum possible points for that component. The final 2 columns show the scores of the Healthy Eating Research menu and then the AAP menu. In general, both menus received high total scores greater than 95 out of 100 possible points. Notable differences between the menus are seen in the fatty acids component, which is a ratio of the saturated to unsaturated fats. The AAP menu score was lower in this component than the Healthy Eating Research score because we endeavored to keep the calorie level appropriate for a 12 to 24-month-old. Thus, we were constrained to use vegetables cooked without oil in the AAP menu, where the Healthy Eating Research menu had room to fit in vegetables cooked in oil. This improved the fatty acid ratio score, but also exemplifies a key point of the guidelines, which is that for this age group, every bite counts. Next slide. So here you see the exemplary menu results repeated, but also the remainder of the results for this first analysis, which was the investigation of foods reported on low-quality intake days. These days were characterized by fast foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, and desserts, with infrequent reports of adequacy components such as dairy and seafood and plant protein. Thus, our conclusions for this analysis are that yes, the HEI Toddlers-2020 yields a high score for exemplary menus and low scores for low-quality intake days. Next slide. Our second question, does the index allow for sufficient variation in scores among individuals, was explored by estimating distributions of component and total scores using the NHANES diet recall data. The expectation is that a full range of scores would be seen across the distribution for most components and the total score. The results of this analysis showed that across most components, the full range of possible scores were seen. However, dairy, total fruits, and total protein foods had a narrower range, with virtually no toddlers scoring a 0 and all reaching the maximum score by around the 75th percentile, indicating that almost all toddlers in the US consume these foods daily, and most consume them in adequate amounts. 8 component scores reached their maximum at around the 75th percentile of the distribution, though exceptions were dairy, which reached a max at around the 50th percentile, and added sugar, which even at the 99th percentile only reached a score of 8.6 out of 10. Next slide. Next, we asked, does the index assess diet quality independent of diet quantity? And to examine this, we estimated Pearson correlations between component scores and energy intake in NHANES. If the score was separating quality from quantity, we would expect to see a low correlation between the scores and energy, and this is in fact what we found. There were low correlations between the scores and energy intake, with the magnitude of the correlation being smaller than 0.2 for all component scores. Only fatty acids with a correlation of 0.15 was deemed significantly different from 0, and the correlation between total score and total energy intake was low and not statistically different from 0, allowing us to conclude that the index is separating diet quality from diet quantity. Next slide. We then wanted to know if the HEI Toddlers 2020 was multidimensional in nature. And to examine this, we conducted a principal component analysis using the NHANES data. Our expectation was that no single factor would explain the total score. Next slide. So here's the result of that analysis, which is a scree plot of the principal components showing 4 components with eigenvalues greater than 1, indicating that at least 4 factors are underlying the score. Next slide. So the summary of the results of our 4th analysis is that no single linear combination of components could explain the variation in the total score, and as stated earlier, at least 4 factors underlie the score. Additionally, this analysis indicated that 6 factors were needed to explain 80% of the variance of the total score. Thus, we conclude that yes, the index is multidimensional. Next slide. Moving into evaluation of concurrent validity, in our 5th analysis, we wanted to know how does the HEI Toddlers 2020 compare to the HEI 2020? And to do this, we used the same 24-month-old subset of the NHANES sample and calculated both the HEI Toddlers and the HEI 2020 scores for the same reported intakes. We would expect that the scores on both indices would be similar, but also expect differences in component scores to reflect differences in the scoring standards between the 2 scores. Next slide. So here are the results of that analysis. As expected, the scores are similar in many regards. The major differences between the indices are related to different dietary guidance between the age groups, particularly in saturated fat and added sugars. In the DGA, saturated fat is not explicitly limited for children under age 2, so the scoring standard is more lenient in the toddler HEI, resulting in higher HEI toddler scores on saturated fat. Contrastingly, added sugars are not recommended at all for toddlers, while the guidance is more lenient for those over age 2 years. This results in a stricter scoring standard utilizing the HEI Toddlers 2020. Next slide. In summary, the results of the comparison analysis showed that when scoring the same intakes in the same population, the total HEI Toddlers 2020 score was about 2 points higher than if that same diet was scored with the HEI 2020. 7 of the component scores did not change or changed only slightly, while 6 changed by more than 1 point and in varying directions. From this analysis, we can conclude that while the 2 indices yielded similar results, differences between some component scores are noteworthy due to the difference in dietary guidance for those under age 2 compared to those who are older. Next slide. In analysis 6, an assessment of reliability, we asked what are the relationships among the index components and the total score. To do this, we estimated Pearson correlations between component scores and item rest correlations between the component and total score using NHANES data. Since we expect that the score reflects distinct dietary components, we expect low correlations between unrelated components. We do expect moderate to high correlations between related and coupled components such as total fruits and whole fruits. And as expected, our results showed high correlations among similar components. Additionally, dairy was found to be highly negatively correlated with the fatty acid score and the saturated fat score, which is expected due to the high saturated fat content in dairy foods consumed by toddlers. item rest correlations, which is the correlation between the component and the total score minus that component, in other words, the rest of the components, mostly showed low to moderate correlations of magnitude 0.2 to 0.45. The most strongly correlated component with the total score was greens and beans, with a correlation of 0.54. Interestingly, under this analysis, coupled components were found to be less correlated when compared to prior HEI analyses we've done for the over 2 population. And we think that this can be attributed to the tendency of toddlers to consume less mixed dishes and more single, non-mixed foods, but this hypothesis requires further exploration. Next slide. In our final analysis, we were interested to know how internally consistent the HEI Toddlers 2020 score is. To investigate this, we calculated Chromebox alpha for NHANES dietary data. A moderate value is expected due to the multidimensional nature of the score. The resulting value of 0.48 is in line with our expectations for a multidimensional tool. However, this is lower than we have seen in prior HEI evaluations. We believe that noise in the measurement of toddler diet, as well as less variability in toddler food choices, likely contribute to this difference, though again, this hypothesis requires further investigation. Next slide. Now, I've spent the last 10 minutes or so describing how we align the evaluation of the psychometric properties of the HEI toddler with prior evaluations of previous iterations of the HEI. But there remain many future directions for evaluating and refining recommendations around use of this HEI toddlers. For example, the index could be evaluated to investigate whether the recommended age for use of the HEI toddlers, currently 12 through 23 months, should be adjusted. Would we make different conclusions about the validity of the score for breastfeeding toddlers if we investigated a sample with a greater number of breastfeeding toddlers than were in the NHANES sample? Are subgroups with different eating patterns, such as toddlers consuming plant-based milks, adequately assessed by the HEI toddler? And finally, relating to how these two indices can be utilized in conjunction, what are the best practices for studies with populations that span the age range recommendations? These questions we intend to look at in the future to continue to refine the evaluation of the HEI toddlers. And with that, I'd like to turn this over for more considerations and directions to my colleague, Dr. Kirsten Herrick.
Thanks. My colleagues have done the hard work and presented all the details on the indices. I'd like to take a step back and provide the 10,000-foot view to emphasize some broad themes that emerged during our work with the HEI 2020 and the HEI Toddlers 2020. The title for this section provides the outline for this portion of my presentation: Continuity, Considerations, and Future Directions for the HEI Toddlers 2020. Next slide. One of the themes I hope you've picked up on is the continuity that characterizes the HEI 2020 and the HEI Toddlers 2020. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because the previous speakers have provided a lot of details. I just want to emphasize what you've already heard. Although there were enough differences to warrant a new index for toddlers, there was still a lot of continuity between the two. There was the same process for developing the index, and the same partners were involved. The same guiding principles were used, with the addition of one to allow for bridging between the two indices. And similarly, the same features were applied in both indices. But as my colleagues have shared, there were some special considerations around a few of the components. Next slide. You've heard about what was the same. Now let's talk about some considerations that we felt were important to reflect on for HEI Toddlers 2020. Next slide. First, I want to talk about data collection. The dietary guidelines were developed using National Nutrition Surveillance data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's important to recognize that the dietary data collected has historically focused on what, when, and how much. We acknowledge that there are some dimensions that are important to consider for children, such as the context, which can influence dietary patterns. For example, who is feeding a young child may influence what foods are provided. Similarly, where food is provided, at home, at school, or in transit, may also contribute to the dietary pattern. Additionally, we acknowledge that there are some well-described limitations associated with the 24-hour dietary recall data that are the source and foundation of the dietary pattern modeling used to develop the HEI. The measurement error and biases associated with the dietary assessment in general also apply to children younger than 24 months. Next slide. Plus, there are some additional considerations that are unique to young children. There are proxy reporters, distant reporters, and oftentimes multiple reporters. There are small consumptions amounts. Also, it's difficult to capture some leftovers. And it's important to recognize that food composition databases can lag, and often it's difficult to keep up with changes in the marketplace. And I just want to mention here that human milk is important because although the HEI Toddlers 2020 focuses on complementary foods, human milk and infant formula may factor into the dietary patterns of infants and toddlers. And the databases for human milk often suffer from out-of-date information. Next slide. Let's switch gears and talk about data analysis. First, I'll put in a plug for more research in this area. For the purposes of developing the dietary guidelines, it's important to have nationally representative samples. There are very few of these available. The NHANES program does a fair job at capturing some information, but not all. We as a community of data users need to think about ways to support NHANES and also be creative about how to obtain the necessary information from different or new sources. But that's a conversation for another day. Next slide. To focus on the topic at hand, we should consider a conceptual question, which is, what is usual intake for a toddler? The diet of young children can vary considerably within a day and from day to day. For example, on one day, a child may consume strawberries at every opportunity, and the next day refuse to eat a single one. So what is consumed and how much is consumed is highly variable. Yet the dietary guidelines and analytic methods used to assess adherence are built on the concept of usual intake. By that I mean dietary guidelines are meant to be met over time through usual diet. And as we heard in the previous section on evaluation, the analytic approach used to estimate HEI and its components uses usual intake methodology. So I'll hint at what's coming next in the future directions section. More research is needed to understand when and whether the assumptions used for those 2 and over about describing usual intake also apply for children less than 2. Next slide. Another data analysis consideration is related to how we specify variables in models used to estimate usual intake. For individuals 2 and older, age has been modeled continuously by year of age. With HEI Toddlers 2020, we used a different variable for age to reflect the rapid growth experienced by toddlers, weight for age z-scores, where age was defined in months. We felt it was important to consider and hypothesize that it's reasonable that other age groups might warrant a second look. So again, this is another hint at future directions. There may be other inflection points to consider across the lifespan. Next slide. To finish this section on data, I want to touch on data use and interpretation. I want to reiterate what you've already heard. HEI Toddlers 2020 is recommended for use with children 12 through 23 months. But this naturally raises a question about whether it can be used above and below this range. Next slide. Let's start with the question, can HEI Toddlers 2020 be used for those under 12 months? The short answer is no, for multiple reasons. First, let's address younger infants, younger than 6 months. So at about 6 months, the DGAs recommend encouraging a variety of foods from all food groups. Prior to this, the diet is milk-based, either human and or infant formula. Recall that the HEI Toddlers 2020 assesses complementary foods. So the application of the index to infants younger than 6 months doesn't really make sense. The index can't be applied to this group because they are likely not consuming any or many complementary foods. So what about slightly older infants? Can HEI Toddlers 2020 be used for infants around 6 months through 11 months? The answer here is still no. Again, the index assesses complementary foods, while older infants are hopefully getting exposed to a variety of foods with different tastes and textures. As mentioned previously, their diets are highly variable. This, combined with a small caloric intake, means that we have no expectation that within that low caloric intake, that an infant could cover all components of the HEI. So the index really can't be applied. Let's move on to considering whether HEI Toddlers 2020 could be applied to children older than 23 months. Next slide. Here, the answer is maybe, but it's important to think through the research question. Remember, the goal of the HEI is to assess adherence to the dietary guidelines. So once you apply HEI toddlers beyond the intended age, you're no longer comparing intake against the dietary guidance specific for that age. During the development of the HEI Toddlers 2020, we talked at length about this situation and conceived of at least one use case where it could be defended. For example, if you want to assess the diet quality of children 1 to 3 years, crossing over that junction, and wanted to keep everyone on the same scale. We can discuss this more in the Q&A later. Now I want to switch gears and talk about some future directions that might be in store for HEI toddlers. So future directions really speaks to evolution. If you're familiar with previous versions of the HEI, you know that there's a precedence for evolution to keep pace with any changes in dietary guidelines. During the development of HEI Toddlers 2020, we thought about 3 areas that might spur evolution in the future, and they are multidimensional eating environments, measuring diet across the lifespan, and bridging HEI Toddlers 2020 and HEI 2020. Next slide. Earlier, I mentioned that dietary assessment has traditionally focused on what, how much, and more recently, when we eat. I also alluded to other features that influence eating behavior. On this slide, additional features like where, when, how, and who provides the food are important features to consider for young children. As highlighted in this paper by Zimmer et al., there are significant gaps in these areas, both with regards to data collected in these areas and critically in the availability of tools to collect these data. There's a great need in this area for additional investigation. Next slide. Another area we anticipate evolution is with regard to measuring diet across the lifespan. This figure from Chong in the British Journal of Nutrition illustrates the concept of diet across the lifespan eloquently in one slide. Along the x-axis, you see life stages, and dietary scores are represented along the y-axis. The 3 lines on the graph represent different trajectories of diet scores. At the top, there's a relatively stable and healthy dietary score. In the middle, there's a moderately healthy, though less stable score. And at the bottom, we see a less healthy diet trajectory. Looking at the diet trajectories, we can identify points where changes are occurring and target these changes for intervention. Now, the HEI has traditionally started at age 2, leaving out a very influential period for establishing dietary patterns. We anticipate lots more research into diet trajectories. Now, so with a small bit of fanfare, I want to present to you the new HEI Toddlers 2020 for children aged 12 through 23 months. Next slide. This slide depicts data from N. Haynes 2011 through 2018 for children 12 to 23 months old. Now, since it's been a while since Dr. Shams-White presented the radar plots, let me briefly provide a refresher. The outer edge of the radar plot, depicted in green, represents 100% of maximum score, and the 13 components have their own spokes that radiate out from the center. The center represents 0 of the maximum score. So the blue shape represents an overall HEI score of 63.4. The reason I'm showing this radar plot in this section about evolution will become clear in the next slide. Next slide, yep. So now I'm showing the same previous radar plot with the addition of a dotted green line. Now this line represents the same children. So these are the same children, but they're scored with HEI 2020. Now I know you're going to say, hang on, you told me we shouldn't do that, but bear with me just a moment. So immediately you can see there's a difference in the shape. That difference is highlighting the tension at the junction between these indices for some components. And I'll talk through that next. Next slide. Specifically, let's look at added sugars and saturated fat because there are differences in the guidelines at 2 years at the junction of these 2 indices. As we heard earlier, the 2020-2025 DGAs recommend that prior to age 2, infants and toddlers avoid foods and beverages with added sugars. For the component added sugars, the score is lower for the HEI Toddlers 2020 at 44%, compared with HEI 2020, which is 89%, because the same diet scored with the index for ages 2 and older allows for a small amount of added sugar, compared with the goal of no added sugar for younger children. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through other examples, but just highlight here that there are other components, for example, saturated fats that demonstrate a similar tension. So the 2020-2025 DGAs created an implied boundary at 2 years old. Future iterations of the guidelines may have to wrestle with additional implied boundaries around 6 months, 6 or 12 months. Although the lifespan approach theoretically positions age on a continuum, dietary guidelines are still determined for discrete age categories that can be studied in isolation. for example, separating birth to 24 months from younger children. This naturally raises questions around other boundary points, particularly at what age or cut points guidance differ. For this reason, we anticipate evolution, but we can't say what that might be yet. Next slide. Again, in the interest of time, I won't read all of these questions, but will direct you to the publication below so you can contemplate the questions at your leisure. You'll note that the last bullet here summarizes some of the discussion I just covered about the boundary at age 2. Next slide. The top bullet on this page touches on multidimensionality that was presented at the beginning of the section on evolution. I encourage you to review and think about how to move the field forward. Next slide. I'll wrap things up by saying that there are now 2 HEIs available. The new HEI Toddlers-2020 that assesses diet quality for young children 12 through 23 months, and the updated HEI 2020, which assesses diet quality for children and adults 2 years and older. The HEIs can be used to examine different research questions, and we look forward to seeing how you will apply these tools in your research. Next slide. With that, I'd like to say thank you for your time and attention on behalf of the HEI team shown here, and I want to acknowledge the important contributions from Kevin Dodd, Lisa Kale, and Kelly Scanlon. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. This has been a wonderful presentation, and part of the evidence for that is how many great questions we've gotten. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. If we're not able to answer all the questions today, we will try to get these questions answered and provide them to those of you who attended the webinar today. So stay tuned for more on that. But for now, we're going to get to as many as we can. I want to start with, we had a couple of questions about human milk or breastfeeding and infant formula, including why both of those are excluded from the index and how breastfeeding is accounted for in the new HEI for toddlers. And I was wondering, Jennifer Lerman, if you could address that.
Yeah, thank you for those great questions. And I know it's a little bit complicated, and also we were going through a lot of content. So just to sort of reiterate, the reason that the infant formula or human milk are excluded from the calculation of the score is because the index is designed to assess the quality of the mix of complementary foods and beverages in the toddler diet, regardless of whether some in this age group, over 12 months, are still consuming human milk or even infant formula. Because human milk and infant formula contribute to energy intake, the denominator of most HEI which is the denominator of most HEI components, but they wouldn't contribute to the numerator of any of the adequacy components. Keeping these foods out of the HEI score itself keeps those items from diluting the HEI score. It also allows us to make direct comparisons about the complementary foods and beverages only across children who might have had some human milk. They may have been breastfeeding, they might have had infant formula or some others, other item like that, that we can't really assess or compare. It can be a little bit confusing because, we know that kids, and I think too, Rebecca might have shown this data, there are still breastfeeding kids and kids who are taking infant formula at 12 months and up through 18 months. And I think someone in the questions also mentioned the AAP recommendations beyond 2 years of age is even a possibility. But if you think about across time with these kids under age 12 months, those foods, breast milk, human milk, infant formula, are contributing a much greater proportion of energy and their food intake. As they get older, that proportion becomes less and less. And so our index is really looking at just assessing the quality of the foods consumed, sort of regardless of that proportional intake. Below 12 months, it's a little more complicated because that proportion is much higher, which is why the index and the pattern don't go below 12 months. We had another question in the chat about whether there's a plan to design an HEI for 0 to 1. And currently we don't have a plan to design that for the guidelines that came out in 2020. Our goal is to really align the index with the guidelines And because there isn't a food pattern for under age 12 months, and because of this proportionality of much greater intake from human milk and infant formula in the underage 12 months group, we really can't design the same kind of index. We also don't know what's going to come in the next 2025 guidelines. And so that's something that might be under consideration in the future, but there isn't a plan to do anything currently for the 0 to 12-month-old age group. I think that covers most of the breastfeeding questions that we got. Oh, one other part, you can use the index even if children have reported breast milk or infant formula. So you would just exclude any calories. If you've imputed breast milk values, you exclude that. And then you calculate the HEI using the total calories of the rest of the foods and, the food groups and other component nutrients that make up the numerators of the score. Thank you for
Great, thank you so much. So we also had a quick question about the SAS code and when that will be available. Marissa, do you want to?
Sure. I'm going to actually share a couple links. So in the chat, but we do have currently the HEI 2015 code. As I mentioned, there's no difference in the components for HEI 2020. So the code could be used, but we will update it for HEI 2020. But we're working on updating SAS code for both that and the Toddlers 2020, aiming for this fall. So I'll share the link to what we currently have, and you see a message for that's coming soon. But can share links for that, and also for radar plots for anyone interested in how to create those as well.
Okay, and do you want to say anything more about radar plots right now while you've got the floor?
Sure. So again, I'll share a link to this in the chat in a moment, but just want to highlight, again, it's a great way to visualize the different components of the HEI simultaneously and allow for comparison and analyses. I do want to make a quick additional note that it's a good idea to display the components on the radar plot the same way each time. So you can look at the order we have it on the site, but that will help further make it easier to compare the different visuals. So again, I'll share that information shortly. But yes, and then the SAS code will again be coming soon.
Thank you. All right. And so let me go to another question we had here that I think maybe to Rebecca. And the question is, for adults, could you explain a bit on the differentiation across US style, vegetarian, and Mediterranean diets using the HEI? And this person says that they assume that that these are different than the Mediterranean Diet Index.
Sure. So the Healthy Eating Index is different from the Mediterranean Diet Index. In the dietary guidelines for Americans, there are 3 example dietary patterns that are published that can all be tailored to personal preferences, cultural foodways, budgetary considerations, etc. And so we would expect that because these 3 examples of dietary patterns carry the same key elements of a healthy dietary pattern defined in the guidelines. So if someone was aligning their diet with any of these 3 dietary patterns, they would score similarly on the Healthy Eating Index.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we have several questions also about the clinical implementation of these indexes. The first one was, what recommendations do you have for clinical implementation of the HEI to assess people's nutrition intake? And then another person was asking whether or not the HEI tool could be used at the individual level in practice. So, Jill, Kirsten, do you want to respond to those questions?
I was just going to note, and this is a question we get a lot, the HEI itself isn't a checklist or a diet assessment instrument that gathers data about what people eat. Rather, the HEI is a scoring metric that can be used to determine the diet quality of an existing foods or reported foods. So one of the questions would be, I guess that I would have as to think about what is the data capture that person might be considering in the clinic. What kind of tool. We have different tools like the automated self-administered 24-hour recall, which Kirsten can provide more details about, as well as the diet history questionnaire that Kirsten can also provide more details about. And those are different tools that can be used. And the diet history questionnaire actually does have related to it now a HEI report for return of results. And that's something that's available now on our website through the diet history questionnaire. So that's one potential way to think about it. But it really would depend, again, sort of on the goals in that clinic assessment, how that might be used. And I'll pass it over to Kirsten if she wants to clarify what I said.
I think you did very well with that explanation. I don't know that there's anything I would add onto it aside from the HEI. Of course, we're talking about clinical applications in this context, but there's also use primarily in populations, but then across different food systems. So we can use it different ways. And as Jill mentioned, you can get an individual's HEI report from the diet history questionnaire. So that's a food frequency questionnaire. And I will try and drop links in the chat so folks can get access to the DHQ.
Hey, all right, thank you so much. And so we've got another question here that I wanted to ask Jill to answer. How does the HEI 2020 count alcohol?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question. And again, another question that we get a lot. The HEI doesn't account for excessive energy from alcohol as a separate component, but it continues to account for all the energy from alcohol within the total energy, so that denominator for most components. And alcohol is really unique, as we all know, among the different dietary components that we're looking at. And so, we have had a lot of discussion about the consideration for inclusion or exclusion in an index like the HEI. And, even though alcohol is consumed as a beverage most often and contributes energy to the diet, it also does share characteristics with drugs due to its pharmacologic effects on bodily systems. There's also sort of a second issue that an all alcohol component, if we had included that in the HEI, that wouldn't always be appropriate for certain individuals, for example, like the HEI toddlers, or for certain environments when it's applied to the food environment, for example, looking at school meals. And so that would cause some challenges in the issue of comparability across the different components and the scores. And then I think the last point is among the different dietary constituents that are covered in the dietary guidelines, alcohol carries a caution for excessive intakes on a given day. So although we know the cumulative total or usual intake may also be important. So the inclusion of alcohol complicates the derivation of the score from how we think about total diet. So alcohol has been assessed and scored based on a single day, whereas all of our other dietary recommendations have been scored using usual intake as a point of reference. So given that, that's why we don't have alcohol as a separate component in the index. But we always want to point out to people, if alcohol is something that's of interest, it should be assessed separately in terms of grams or drinks per day, or included as a covariate in statistical modeling, along with the HEI scores, or apart from HEI scores, depending on the research question.
Thank you. And so another question we had was whether there's any sort of adjustment in the HEI for people who are lactose intolerant, given that dairy is 10% of the final score.
And sure, I'm happy to address that question. So one of the features of the HEI is that it doesn't require a single food or beverage to be consumed to receive a perfect score. And related to the dairy and fortified soy group, I'll note that all fluid, dry, or evaporated milk, including lactose-free and lactose-reduced product, as well as fortified soy beverages and yogurt products, contribute to achieving the food group goals. But for those of you interested in this topic, you might also be interested in following along in the current dietary guidelines advisory committee's discussions, and they've identified a protocol related to the topic. So if you're interested, you can go to dietaryguidelines.gov and even register for next week's public meeting to hear more on those current conversations.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we have time perhaps for one more question here. And I am going to go with one here about the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines included recommendations for women who are pregnant and lactating. Will there be a separate HEI score for this life stage group?
I can,
No,
either
go
one.
ahead,
There were not dietary patterns specific to individuals who are pregnant or lactating published in the dietary guidelines, and so the HEI 2020 applies nicely to this age group as well.
Okay. All right, and I do want to point out to all of those in the audience that a number of links have been put in the chat, so be sure to grab those before you leave. Links to some important publications that may be helpful to you, and fact sheets also that will be helpful. So please do get those. And one last quick question. We already answered a question about SAS code. Is there also R code available? Can anyone answer that?
Sure, I can go ahead and answer that. And that's another question that we get a lot because there are different kinds of coding that people use for HEI. And so we definitely support SAS code for the work that we're doing that's on our website. And so we can link to that. I think we have that in the chat. And we also welcome other folks with other coding so that we can share that. And I think because we just launched the HEI in September, and so September is when we'll have our code available on our website. We'll then be looking at other sources as well.
Okay, great. And we've got just about a minute and a half left for one more question, which I will go to, which is the question about, let's see, it's about age here, and it's whether the 2+ HEI SAS macro takes age into consideration when calculating the overall score, and does it evaluate concordance to age-specific dietary recommendations, or does it assume that diet recommendations are all the same for all ages 2+, and therefore that you should adjust for age in the models? Jennifer, do you want to grab that one?
Sure. I think this is about the 2+ HEI, and it does a little bit, I think, depend on which method you are using. Jill, you can correct me if I'm not right here. I think if you are using the MCMC modeling, there is some age being accounted for in groups in the model. But I think you still would adjust for age. The macro, the simple SAS macro, is only giving you the score. So it's just giving you an HEI score, and then you can use the results of that macro to put you have your HEI scores. You can use it in your model or as your outcome, whatever it is that your research question is. If age is important, if you have a large population that spans a lot of ages, you might need to put age in your model. And Jill, can you correct anything that's not accurate there?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that, I go back to the HEIs, the standards for the HEI are based on the least restrictive recommendations as we look across the calorie ranges for 2 and older, so that we can have a common metric that can be applied and compared to different age groups. And I think that, as Jen was saying, we would want to be thinking about looking at age dependent on your research question, how you might be thinking about that and including that in your model. And I think this is one of the big questions then that we've had now, having a different HEI toddlers, to be thinking about how do we really look at the rapid growth and development that's occurring in that age range, which is very different than what we see as we're looking across the other trajectory. But it still poses additional questions that would be worthwhile to examine.
Thank you so much. We are unfortunately out of time for more questions today, but I want to just extend a thank you to our amazing panel today, and also a thank you to all of you in the audience for your very engaged and thoughtful questions. Thank you. And again, we will try to answer anything we were not able to answer here today. We'll try to get that to you if you were on the attendance list for today. Now, I want to move on to a few in-core announcements before we close out today. I wanted to be sure that everyone knows that INCORE has recently published a research commentary in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics that identifies measurement gaps specific to the first 2 years of life and proposes research opportunities for addressing these gaps. And that article is linked right now in the chat, so please take a look for that. Also, if you would like to learn more about INCORE, we recently published a commentary in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine titled National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity Research Efforts to Advance Childhood Obesity Research, Progress and Next Steps. And again, the link for that, you can read that article for free, and the link is in the chat for you now. If you would like to learn more about INCORE and read through our latest annual report, which is Connecting Research to Communities, that highlights our work with communities, researchers, practitioners, and students with evidence-based tools and resources. You can also take a look for that online, and we put that link in the chat as well. And if you are not already signed up for our newsletter to get updates on the latest INCORE publications, tools, and resources, plus any upcoming events like this webinar, you can sign up for that at www.incore.org/e-newsletter. And also, if you haven't done it already, we would love for you to check out our student hub, the incore.org/student-hub is a place where you can find great materials for students and other scholars. And if you have used any of INCORE's tools, we would love to hear about it. So please send us an email at incore@fhi360.org, and who knows, we may even feature your story in our next webinar. Remember, if you are not already following us on social media, to follow us there and like us. If you don't already follow us, we are on Twitter and also on Facebook. So please, please do keep up with our announcements there as well. And we encourage you to take the post-webinar survey that's going to open up when this webinar ends. So if you just stay online, but the webinar closes out, you'll get a chance to give us some feedback that we can incorporate into future webinars. And we hope that you will be joining us for our next Connect and Explore webinar. Be sure to sign up for our email and for social media updates on those upcoming dates. Thank you so much for being part of today's webinar, and hope you have a good rest of your week. And thank you again to all of our panelists today.